Hey everyone, this is Mike. Just wanted to let you know before we get into this episode that we have a special guest interview with author Chris Bailey at the end of this segment. Chris has been on a lot of different podcasts talking about the content of the book, so in this episode we talk about the process. We talk about the lessons that he learned from writing the first book, The Productivity Project, and how he applied those in this book, and we nerd out about some mechanical keyboards and the writing process itself. So if you want to go straight to that section, there are chapter markers in this episode which will allow you to do just that. And if you're a regular listener of Bookworm, make sure that you don't tune out early and you stick around for that conversation because it gives a little bit different perspective on the book writing process. It's a really fun conversation. So with that said, here is Hyperfocus by Chris Bailey. We got a big episode today, so we better jump in here. Let's go straight to follow-up if you're okay with that.
I'm good. Ready, set, go.
All right. So I've got 3 of them. We'll start with the one that is impossible to quantify. That is of me being a better friend.
The cheater action.
Now, I like to think that I did better in this area. I can think of a couple instances that I could say, I think I was a better friend because of this, but ultimately it doesn't matter what I think. It matters the impression that I left with people. That's kind of the thing that I've been thinking about lately. Because another one of my action items is to make a list of what I can and can't control. So kind of related, but kind of getting into that one. One of the things that I wrote on that list is that I cannot control how people respond to what I write or what I throw out on the internet. And I know you've dealt with haters online, Joe. So
yeah, 2 or 3.
It can be frustrating. But what you can control is how you make somebody feel once you've been with them. So this was an interesting action item because it allowed me to recognize which levers I can really pull and do something about and which ones I really can't do anything about. I also, from this exercise of creating the 2 lists, what I can and can't control, recognize that there is actually a third list. So there are things that I can control, there are things that I cannot control, and there are things that I can influence. So I have a limited amount of control over them. And some of the things on this list, just to give people some examples: quarterly goals for agent efficiency. I'm involved with the management team. I go down to Austin once a quarter. We talk about our quarterly goals. I can say, this is what I think our goals should be, and this is why. And I know my input is heard and valued, but I don't get to be the one who's like, hey, this is what we're doing, guys.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And then if you take that approach, not just with work, but also like your family, I can control or I can influence the level of planning and organization that we have at home, but I can't control it completely. Just as an example, my wife and I have a shared family calendar. I can do my part to make sure that it's always up to date. She's got to do her part too. So I can influence that, but I can't completely control it. And this is interesting because typically, like when you have these systems in a family specifically, I think, you notice them when they don't work. And when they don't work, the tendency is to say to the other person, well, you messed up. So when you view it as like, I can influence, but I can't control it, it's kind of forcing you to think about it as like a 50-50 split. So it's like, we messed up and we need to fix this, which totally changes the conversation.
That's interesting. Yeah. I haven't really thought about that. I've always thought of things as being like, yes, I can do that piece. Like that's definitely something I set the direction for it. And these are other areas where absolutely can't do a darn thing about those, but I've never really considered about the ones that are like the in-betweeners. So that's interesting.
Yeah, so kind of along these same lines, I mentioned one of my gap books was Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Right.
He has a quote in there where every time you do a habit that you want to create, you're casting a vote for the person that you want to become. He's got a big emphasis on identity-based habits. So if you want to be a writer, what does a writer do? You know, they write. And so by showing up to write every day, you've identified with becoming a writer, just as an example. And so you can take that approach to, I think for this, what can I influence list is like, this is casting my vote for what the organization or the family unit or whatever team I'm a part of should be. And then really after that, like trust the process. So control what you can control and then don't worry about the rest. But I don't know, it kind of compartmentalizes it and frames it in a way that like when you do the thing that you can do, it it's kind of like, okay, there, I've done my part, if that makes sense. So you feel good about doing the right action, and now you're kind of okay with whatever outcome happens because at least you did your thing. And obviously, if you don't get the result you want, then you meet and you adjust and you repair. Constant growth, constant progress. That's kind of the theme of Bookworm. I don't know. Does that make sense? Where it's like, at least I've done what I can do.
Right.
I don't have to feel bad about, or think that, if I just would have done this thing different, or if I would have done this and I ran out of time or whatever. It's like, no, I've done what I can do. I've controlled what I can control. And so the results, now the score is going to take care of itself.
At least your side of it. Like that's kind of how I'm seeing a lot of what you're talking about. Like, yes, there's a lot that you can do in some scenarios. I'm thinking about situations where you volunteer to lead teams, say at a nonprofit or something. And in those scenarios, although, we like to think that whenever someone commits to something, they don't always, like, they're always going to be there, but that doesn't always hold true. But you can't change their reaction to their own commitment. You can only do everything you can to help them follow through on their own commitment. It's like, okay, I've done all the things I can do to help you follow through on what you told me you were going to do. Now I just have to trust that you'll either do that or I'll have to react to you not doing it. Like, that's, I think there's something a little bit freeing in that.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of that's the theme with the other stuff on my list too. What I recognize is that there's things that I can't control, but there's elements of that I can control. So for example, if my kids are acting out or they're not listening, I can't really control that, but I can control my response when that happens.
Sure.
I can't necessarily control how much energy I have at the beginning of my day, but I can control what time I go to bed the night before to make sure that I get enough sleep.
Yeah. Yep.
I can't control how much things cost, but I can control how much I save or budget. And I can't control, for example, when something awful is going to happen, but I can control whether I am ready for an emergency. Some of the other things that I can control, because this list is a little bit longer, things like my daily schedule, who I work with, what I do for work. I mentioned how people feel when I've been with them. I can control what I say yes to. I can control whether I follow through on those habits that I know I need to do, like whether I journal every day, whether I complete my entire morning routine. And I can also control, I think with this whole internet creator space, this is interesting because you create something, you throw it out there, and you think like, okay, there, I've done it. And then my response typically is people love it, hate it, whatever. It is what it is. It's the natural culmination of my experiences. So I'm not going to try and change it to tailor to somebody. Like, this is just authentically me. This is who I am. Okay. But I tend to just throw things out there and never tell anybody about them, which is completely ridiculous because the people try to build these audiences. They try to build these email lists. They try to build these social media followings. And that's not really what I've been focused on. But I recognize that, like, I create stuff, I throw it out there, and I tell nobody. And on some level, I'm kind of wondering, like, maybe there is a little bit of fear tied to that where I just don't want to deal with a potentially negative reaction. But if I'm giving my best effort to these things, then one of the things that I can control is the promotion for the things I make. And that's something that I should be doing.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with, some tweets telling us what you did.
Right.
You're not going to scare anybody with that, Mike. Just going to say that.
Yep.
You can tell us what you did. It's okay.
Yeah, so I got to get better at that. The other item I had on my list was make a list of what's good in my life. And this is a fairly long list once I got rolling with it. I forget, there was another action item at one point where I had to make a really lengthy list, and it was really hard at first. And then once I got going, I just cranked through a bunch of them. Kind of the same experience here. You think about like a couple things and you're like, oh, I really like the way this is going, really like the way this is going. And then immediately your brain starts focusing on all the negative stuff too. It's like, well, there's got to be a balance here. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. And you focus on the negative stuff and then you're like, no, that's not the point of the exercise. What else is going right? So I got like 2 or 3 things and then I start thinking about 5 or 6 negative things. But in the end, I ended up with about 20 different things on my what's going well list.
Awesome.
So, and Bookworm's on there.
Go Bookworm. I got 4 here. The first one I've been not so good at, which is doing 3 gratitudes at dinner with my family. You would think this would be simple, This should be one of those things that just becomes a habit, and you do it every time you sit down for dinner. And my mind completely blanks on it. I don't know why that is. I even debated setting a reminder on my phone just to tell me that, but that doesn't work because I set my phone in my office at that time. So I don't even know how to. I keep forgetting. Maybe this conversation will be the spark. Who knows?
This is kind of funny because it sounds like this is your family. These are the people that you are closest to. Of course, I can pick 3 things every single day to be thankful for. And if you really applied yourself, you probably could. But because you went from not doing this to doing this, my immediate thought when you said 3 was like, there's going to be a point of friction there.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's too much. And you don't want to tell people like, don't be as grateful for the things you have. So when we went through it, I wasn't going to be like, hey, you should just dial it back and just do 1. You know? But I feel kind of vindicated that you are kind of struggling with this. Sorry. No, I mean, adjust and repair. That's kind of the theme of Bookworm. You know, you try something that doesn't work, you try something else. But I guess I maybe I should have called this out, but like I kind of had this thought in the back of my head when you announced it. It was like, this maybe is going to be a little bit harder than it sounds.
That's fair.
And I'm curious if anybody else has tried this, like what their experience with it is too.
That'd be interesting.
This makes no sense. Like gratitude, this is something we all recognize as important, but we all suck at it. So it's like, why can't I just do this?
Totally. I'm with you. Yeah, I think I'm probably going to dial this back and granted, our kids are little too, so if you said, let's do gratitudes, they'll look at you funny and like, what does that mean? Like, well, okay. So, yeah, you have to do the whole explanation thing. I think once they get what we're talking about, we'll be able to say that. They just haven't fully comprehended it. So I'm going to leave this one on the list and bring it back the next time. Just saying.
Sounds good.
There you go. I marked it. Another one I've been working on, evening journaling revamp. And this has to do with me being more intentional with what it is that I'm journaling at night. Basically, writing down what went well that day, so that I know, what were the high points of the day. And in some cases, writing down what are a couple things I need to change. And I've done that. I can't say I've done it every night since I've got those questions nailed down, but I have been a lot more consistent with it than I have been in months and years past. So I need to continue building that habit, but I'm still working on it. But it's at least in the right direction, I think.
Nice.
Email patterns. I think you've ridiculed me about email. I don't know how many times.
Yeah.
Okay, here you go. I am going to, for the sake of the show, I'm going to check my email right now just so I can tell you what. Okay, because the last time I ran through my email was an hour and a half ago as we were recording this. Okay, Mike?
Were you at 0?
I was at 0 at that moment.
Okay.
Okay, right now there are 58 emails in here.
Jeez.
Now, granted, this is the heavy part of the day right now, and I know that before I can sign off today, I need to make another pass at those. I have not been great about, like, I haven't fully nailed down what my schedule should be with email to handle it correctly. And I think we're going to talk about it a little bit more in today's episode. I'll bring it up in a couple points here because I have another action item that pertains to email. And when that one comes out, I know you're going to nail me to the wall again. But
nicely.
Don't look down the list, Mike. Don't do it.
Okay.
But anyway, so email patterns, like I think for me, I need about 4, maybe 5 checkpoints in a day when I run through email. I've played with 2, played with 3, but I always, like, even this morning, there was one point when I was really getting anxious because I felt like I was just lost. And then when I did the check here about an hour and a half ago, I realized that was very founded. Like, I should have done a check earlier than when I did. So I think I'm still trying to figure that out and nail down what works so that I can serve my clients well and yet have a little sanity on my side. I will also say that I've been working on some, I don't want to say leadership changes, but I'm bringing a salesperson into my business as well to help handle a lot of those pieces. So this is a classic offloading step for me. So that's part of why I've got a lot going on, because I've been slowly ramping that, the client side of things up a little bit, knowing that I'm going to be handing it off because he's going to be in a much better place to handle that than I will, and we'll need more of that. So anyway, that's what's going on. So email patterns, I'm still working on it. We'll get there.
All right.
The last one here, sketching my workspace. I didn't actually do this. Did we talk about this last time? I didn't actually sketch out what my workspace looked like.
Yeah, I don't want to say made fun of you for it, but kind of made fun of you for it. So I think in the last one you had promised to give it the old college try, which is why I put it back on here, because I really want to see what this looks like. But
sure. I will say that I made the change. This is coming from Work Clean, of trying to put everything in the most efficient place you can. And I did do a rearrange of my desk, and it's not correct. I know that. I have still had a fair amount of friction with my desk setup. So I actually need to do this again, which is why I was a little bit surprised to see it here, because I didn't remember this coming from last episode. So this is the downside of Mike setting up the notes, is he's going to go and snag just random actions from the ones he wants to see.
Well, it was an action item from the last episode. So the original book that it inspired it was Work Clean.
Man, that was sneaky, Mike. Well done. I need to do it again, though, so it's good that it's here. So there you go.
All right. Well, that gets us into today's book, which is Hyperfocus by Chris Bailey, subtitle How to Be More Productive in a World of Distraction, which is I don't want to say clickbaity title, but it's a very provoking title. I think it's very, that's a promise that resonates with just about anybody who would listen to Bookworm. And so this is going to be, at least the subject matter anyways, very appropriate for just about anyone who lives in the information age, who deals with email and social media and all these different things that we're trying to keep up with. This is going to be a good book. And full disclosure, as we're recording this, I've interviewed Chris Bailey on the Productivity Show. We're going to have a little bonus thing later on in this episode where we talk to him about the process and the things that he learned from writing the book. So kind of the Bookworm spin on this. We're not going to just ask him to rehash all the content that he wrote about and has spouted on all the other productivity podcasts that are out there.
That's what we're going to do.
Yeah, we're going to dissect the content itself. But this is one that I covered for a Gap book originally. And I know I talked highly of it, so it's no secret that I liked it. But this is, I think, the first book that has been a Gap book that has graduated to a full episode.
That's an interesting thought. I can't recall another one. There's a couple books that you and I have both done for Gap books that would be very easy for us to just say, let's go record that one.
Yep.
We haven't done that. But yeah, I think you're right. This might be the first time.
Yeah, so let's jump in here. Let's talk a little bit about how the book is structured. There's 10 different chapters, I think, in the book. And the first chapter or two are kind of the introductory section where he explains a couple principles that he's going to be referencing the rest of the book. And then the next several chapters after that are speaking to the idea of hyperfocus. And then later on in the book, he has several chapters devoted to kind of the antithesis of hyperfocus, which is scatterfocus, which is a really interesting approach, I think. There's so much stuff in the productivity space that's just laser focused on focus. It's like, this is the thing you need. And so Chris Bailey kind of has a little bit different approach to that, where he's saying hyperfocus is great. That's maybe what Cal Newport would call deep work. But Chris Bailey's approach is that it's got to be balanced with this scatter focus too. And he talks about how you can kind of use these strategically to recharge your different modes and how they can all work together. So if you were going to break this down into sections, there's probably 3 sections in this book as well.
Yep.
The intro stuff, the hyperfocus, and then the scatter focus. But that's not really the way that it's written, at least the version I have, because I got a pre-release version of this.
Sure. Well, I do not have a pre-release version, and it kind of looks like they didn't want to admit that there were 3 parts in this book, because at least the one I'm looking at, he's got a chapter 0, a chapter 0.5, and then it goes into part 1, which is hyperfocus, and then part 2 for scatter focus. So although he calls it like chapter 0 and then part 1 and part 2, I'm like, there's still 3 pieces to this. Like, don't call it what it is.
Yeah, that chapter 0 stuff, I forgot about that, but that's interesting because that's where he talks about, most people can't even finish a book. So here's some simple things you can do to make sure that you get through this one, which is a cool idea, I think.
And we should note, Chris Bailey, this is a repeat author for us. We did his other book, The Productivity Project. So this is like his second in that realm. And I told a friend earlier in the week who asked me about this book because I was carrying it around with me. And, the point I made to them was, this particular book, I read a lot of productivity and business books. Obviously, we do most of those here on Bookworm, but this is one of the better productivity books I've read in a while, I think. It seemed to really resonate with me, so I really enjoyed this one. So, good pick, Mike.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So you're saying Hyperfocus is one of the better books you've read, not Productivity Project, correct?
Hyperfocus, yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Chris Bailey's got an interesting style, which I'm sure we'll get into, especially at the end. So if you're thinking that you've read Deep Work, why should you read Hyperfocus? It's way different.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, Productivity Project I felt like was a good, give me a quick overview of everything that happens in the productivity space. This specifically plays into one aspect, I think, of productivity. I think of Deep Work being that way. It's there are a lot of things that Cal Newport could have written in Deep Work, but he didn't. He focused on one aspect of doing your best work. And to me, this feels like the same thing, whereas the Productivity Project was borderline high-level overview of everything you could possibly want to know about productivity in the space. This narrows down onto one specific piece of that, which is how do you develop the focus and the attentional space to do that good work, and how do you maintain that focus? So I think it's very well done. I liked this book.
Nice. Hey, that's a great lead into the intro stuff. So there's a couple concepts you need to understand if you're going to read this book, and one of them is that attentional space that you mentioned. So attentional space from the book, he has this really, I don't want to say really cool looking diagram because it's pretty simple. It's basically a circle, but it communicates the point really well that you have so much space that you can pay attention to at one point. He kind of equates attentional space as the RAM in your brain's computer. And then there's different ways that you can fill up that attentional space. So you can be laser focused and doing deep work, and you've got this one thing that's going to require all of your attentional space, and there's no room for anything else. But that doesn't mean that's the only way that you can use your attentional space. And we'll get into the next section, how you can kind of cut this up and the different combinations that are possible here. But I do think that the definition that he has of the attentional space, for me anyways, it really helped me understand I guess, the quantification of this limited resource, because it's hard to put a number on, I've got this much attention, but that's kind of what happens when you look at the diagram that he had.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's a lot of points he brings this diagram back throughout the book. And we'll get into multitasking here in a bit, but or maybe now's a good time because, with attentional space, there's certain things that you can do while you're doing something else because you have space in your attention to devote to more than one thing. He refers to, the concept of walking, chewing bubble gum, and listening to a podcast at the same time, which I thought it was interesting. He mentioned in one of the footnotes that chewing gum sales have declined in recent years, which is fascinating to me. But with all of those things going on, you actually have very little attention going into chewing gum or into walking, but you may be devoting a lot to listening to the podcast. Well, technically that's multitasking. But when we think of in the productivity space, we talk about how, you can't multitask. It's not actually possible. Well, actually, it is.
Yep.
We're referring to the main focus of your attention. You can't have more than one main focus.
Correct.
I think that's how Chris would refer to it. But it is possible to multitask, just not the way we're used to thinking about it traditionally.
Right. So he talks about the 3 combinations that will work with the attentional space that you have available. One of those options is the one complex task. And the reason that most people say you cannot multitask is because people will try to do multiple complex tasks at the same time. And that is not going to work. You can't have your full attention on more than one complex task at a time. And so you're going to miss something. You're going to mess something up. And it's just not worth it to try to work that way. But there are other combinations that work. Like he used the example of a few small habitual tasks, he would call them. He talks a lot about habits in the first couple chapters here, which this is not really a book on habits, but there they are again. And it seems to be something that I keep hearing more and more about. And it makes me constantly go back and look at the habits that I have developed and ask myself, is this the ideal state for my habits? Are there things that I want to change? And then this isn't, the James Clear book, but in that book, he talks about how if you want to make something a desirable habit, if you want that to become a habit, then you make the activation energy lower. If it's something you want to stop doing, then you make the activation energy higher. And so talking about hyperfocus, how does that apply here? For me personally, thinking about the activities that I want to create habits out of and then figuring out how to lower the activation energy so that I can do multiple habitual tasks like that at the same time. And this is also, I think, when we were doing the power of habit, that's when I was reading this the first time. And I mentioned that this has kind of been challenged. This is an idea that's been percolating in my head is how do I take those single complex tasks and make them smaller so they're less complex and actually turn them into habits so that something that I used to have to spend 3 hours of undivided attention on, how can I make that a little bit simpler? And I think you even used the example of like firing up a server in the background. So I know that's possible, but I haven't yet figured out how that works for me. The other combination here, which I should call out because I don't think we talked about it yet, is that if a task requires most of your focus, so not all of it, it's not technically a complex task, you still have a little bit left over for a habitual task. And this is, for me, I think the sweet spot that I want to get to. How do I make things even just a little bit simpler so that I can tack on one additional habit while I'm doing that at the same time? And this is just describing that. Maybe it sounds ridiculous to people, like, oh, you're just trying to crank out as much efficiency as you can at the cost of effectiveness. Maybe, but I don't know. I just want to figure out how I can make things as simple as possible.
Do you have an example of one of these tasks that you want to turn into a habit? Like you referenced, the spinning up servers thing, which is a reference to, sometimes I have demo servers that I need to get going. Well, it's easy for me to do something like, writing show notes for a podcast or something. Like I can do something like that on top of doing the server spin up just because I've done it so many times. It's second nature at this point. Do you have an example of something like that you're interested in turning into, a routine?
Well, not necessarily turning it into a routine, but the show notes example is a good one because I haven't done a lot of the editing for Bookworm, but I have done a couple of the more recent episodes. And I know the first time that I edited an episode, it had been a while since I edited a podcast episode. So I was so focused on the audio that I got done and you're like, hey, where are the links? And I'm like, oh, I didn't even pay attention to the links. So when I did this last time, it was easy for me to be playing the audio and swipe over drafts on the side of my iPad and jot down the things that were mentioned and then turn those into links while I was editing. I didn't have to go back later because for the most part, the Bookworm episodes, at least when I edit them, I keep them pretty pretty true to the initial conversation. I'm not editing out every single and filler word. It's what you see is what you get for the most part. I try to make us sound good and sound like we know what we're talking about, obviously, but it doesn't take a lot of like, I'm not jumping in there all the time to like stop the recording and fix this one little thing where, Joe breathes funny or whatever. And so it's easy.
I don't breathe funny. I never do that.
Well, I couldn't figure out how to get strip silence to work on Ferrite, so there were some spots where I was like, hopefully that that comes out. I think it did. But I'm not going back in there all the time, I guess is what I'm saying. I can pay attention to the audio, and I can still go to Safari and grab a link and put it in the show notes document at the same time. And that is something that when I did it previously was one complex task. So I kind of view that as a task that requires most of my focus, editing the podcast. But the habitual task is just jotting down the notes in drafts.
Got it. That makes sense. I feel like that sort of thing is super powerful.
Yeah. I mean, if I were to, because I made you do this, go back, listen to the episode, and then collect all the links, that's another couple hours worth of work, right? Because I got to go all the way through the episode again.
Well, put it on 2 times speed and go for it.
But still, if I'm able to do that while I'm editing, I've potentially doubled the speed that I can get that task done. Even though one of those is a more complex task and one of them is very simple, it's still very time consuming.
Yep.
So if I can do them both at the same time, hey, yeah, I'm going to do that.
Go for it. Now, in one of these intro pieces, he refers to 4 types of tasks. And it seems like every productivity book has a 4-square matrix of some sort in it. And he even references, it seems like everybody uses one of these charts of sorts, which I appreciated him calling that out. But the 4 quadrants in this particular chart, across the top is unattractive and attractive. Down the left is productive and unproductive. So in the first one, you have productive and unattractive, which is your necessary work. Then you have productive, attractive work, which is your purposeful work. Then you go down the next level, unproductive and unattractive, which is your unnecessary work. Unproductive and attractive, which is your distracting work. So he refers to this necessary work, unnecessary work, purposeful work, and distracting work quite a bit throughout the book. My thought whenever I saw this was, one, this is interesting. It's a different way of categorizing your tasks, but I had this thought in the back of my head of, could I use this in OmniFocus somehow?
I had the same thought.
I've been trying so hard to get used to the tags thing. I'm trying to be a good OmniFocus promoter, but I'm just struggling with the tags thing still. I thought about just putting tags for necessary and unnecessary, or distracting and purposeful, or just using the tags for unattractive, attractive, productive, and unproductive. I thought about doing that, but am I really going to use that? I don't know.
Yeah.
He seems to think I should.
Well, I think you definitely could. And actually, when I read it the first time, I had jotted this down as an action item to divvy up my tasks this way.
Okay.
I never did it, though, because the more I thought about it, I'm like, no.
I was hoping you were going to say you tried it and it didn't work or something like that.
Before I even got there, I was recognizing that this was fraught with failure for me anyways, just the way that I work.
Got it.
But that's really, side note, that's an important distinction with anything that you would hear on this podcast or any other productivity podcast. Just because somebody tried something and it worked for them doesn't mean that it is automatically going to work for you and you're going to get the same result.
Right.
Everybody's situation is a little bit different. So the thing to recognize is the growth mindset, like we talked about in the Carol Dweck book, and listen to these ideas, listen to these principles, these strategies, these tactics, and ask yourself the question, how can I make this work for me? And if you can't make it work for you, then be okay with that. If you were to apply every single quote unquote life hack that you saw, you would do nothing but modify your systems and you wouldn't get any work done ever. You'd be fiddling with it instead of actually doing the work, like David Sparks says.
Right.
So recognize that, this maybe works for Chris and maybe this works for you, but I looked at it, and because I'm constantly asking myself, is this thing a right fit? I recognized before I even implemented it that, yeah, this is not going to give me any benefit when I go to OmniFocus to do my work, because I'm not going to OmniFocus to do my work. I'm going to Jira to do my work. And so it just right away, I was like, nah, that's more work than it's worth.
Sure. Yeah, I tend to live in OmniFocus throughout the day, not from a fiddly stance, but just that's where I keep track of everything I've got going on. So for me, it might make sense, but at the same time, I'm still kind of in flux on how I want to use some of these pieces. So, yeah, I don't know. It was a fun thought, but I don't think it's actually going to follow through.
Yep, it's a good thought exercise. I do think that the value in looking at this diagram, though, really is in recognizing, and Chris calls us out on page 16. He says, the most urgent and stimulating things in your environment are rarely the most significant. So how does that apply to this matrix? Recognizing that there are things that are going to be attractive and productive. That's the purposeful work. That's the stuff that's easy to do. The unattractive and productive stuff, that's the necessary work. That's the stuff that you're going to procrastinate on. And if you recognize that something is approaching you as attractive and you can clarify it as unproductive, you recognize that it's distracting work. It's easier to say no to that thing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me.
Good. Yeah, so the 4 types of tasks here, I do like the way that he describes these. I know that a lot of different productivity books have graphs like this. Most of them, I feel like they should have just stuck to the Eisenhower matrix. This one I thought was actually a cool way of looking at it.
Right. Yeah, every time I see one of these, I wonder, like, okay, does that make sense for me to categorize tasks that way? Like, even the Eisenhower matrix, like, should I tag things as urgent and important? Like, should I do that or not? And more often than not, I realize that's just going to waste my time. Like, that's just not going to...
Yep.
I am never actually going to look at that metadata when it's on there.
Right. Move on to Hyperfocus.
Hyperfocus. What is Hyperfocus?
So the definition from the book is expanding one task, project, or other object of attention to fill your attentional space completely. That is hyperfocus. So it's kind of talking about the third category or combination that you can use for your attentional space, that one complex task. And from there, there's a lot of different, in chapter 3, for example, he talks about like the different stages of hyperfocus, how attention without intention is wasted energy, the rule of 3, lots of different things that pertain to hyperfocus. But hyperfocus itself is really the place that you need to start. And I do think that this definition of hyperfocus is maybe more approachable than the idea that you get from reading Deep Work. Because Deep Work, I love that book, but I kind of feel like you walk away from that thinking, I need to develop my focus muscle. I'm just this puny weakling and I got to get in the mental gym. And hyperfocus, you feel like I could do that. Maybe I can't do it for 8 hours every day, but I can do that.
I wish I could do that all the time.
Right.
Like this is a case of like when he goes through the definition of this and what it entails, I immediately thought of Deep Work, but at the same time, he even called that out in saying like this isn't deep work. It's kind of the mode that you need to be in order to do your deep work, which I really enjoyed. But at the same time, I realized and had to kind of come to grips with the fact that I kind of rarely do this right now. So some of my action items, which I'll get to in a bit, kind of revolve around that, is how do I set myself up to do this? Because I don't right now. I get the feeling that you're able to do this quite a bit. Is that a fair judgment?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that without sounding pretentious, but yeah, I think so. And I think honestly, a big piece of that is just how over time I've shifted the expectations surrounding email.
Yeah.
Where people know when they email me that it may take a week or more for me to get back to you.
Right.
And some people, I mean, should I respond to some people quicker than that? Yeah, I probably should, but not at the expense of doing the things that are really important to me, which it really comes down to doing the important work. So I don't know. I mean, there's good and bad to this. I do think that a lot of it is could be correlated to boundaries or expectations, and you do have to shift that stuff over time. It's not like you can just tell all your clients tomorrow, hey, new policy at joebulig.com. I am no longer going to reply to email except for Friday afternoons. Like that takes some time to get there.
Right.
But I kind of feel like since I've done that, it's easier for me to do this. Yes, that is a fair statement.
And I also feel like the type of work that you do is very conducive to that.
Yes.
Here's the thing, like even if I wanted to work towards that, if I wanted to work to the process where I am checking email once a week, I need to get out of the business that I am in. Like it just doesn't work.
Right.
Especially even if I offloaded the client side, which is part of my plan. So even after that offloading is complete, there will still be things that need responses within 24 hours. So I will still need to be in it at least once a day. Can I get it down to once a day? Probably. I could probably get it to that point. But once a week, that's not going to fly. Like, working in tech will not fly at once a week email checks at all. Like that just won't work. So I feel like that type of... It also depends on the sector, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yep, I totally agree with that. And if you want to work in an industry or you want to set up your business in a way that you are responsive to email, just as the example that we're talking about now, that is completely fine. You just have to recognize that it's going to not facilitate an environment where hyperfocus is incredibly easy to do. And everybody's motivated by one of two things. You're either motivated by the avoidance of pain or the pursuit of pleasure. For me, it's painful to have to be on call for that type of stuff. I hate going into my email client.
Right.
And so it's easy for me to say, yeah, that's something I just don't want to do. But if you are working as a consultant or some industry where you're getting paid good money maybe to solve other people's problems, you've got a golden handcuff situation where maybe that's a little harder to do. And there's probably lots of different things in between there. And so you can kind of define this for yourself, but I guess I've had such a strong negative reaction to living that way that as soon as I started working with Asian efficiency, basically I was like, okay, I want to get as far away from that end of the spectrum as I can. What can I get away with?
Right.
How can I talk to the least amount of people as possible on a regular basis and still get my work done?
Very fair point. Well said. After he does this whole definition of hyperfocus, he does a number of things to help us through the process of how do we actually develop this as a habit and how do you make it a part of your routine. And some of that is setting up like what he calls distraction-free mode, which we see in a lot of places. But he goes a little bit further in defining the types of distractions that you may run into in that process. And guess what? We have a 4-quadrant grid here, again, that he morphed the bottom two into one.
I love this one, by the way.
You like this one?
Yeah, this one's really good, I think.
This is kind of a fun one. 4 types of distractions. Those that are fun, those that are annoying, those that you have no control over, and those that you do have control over.
Yeah, just to describe the picture.
Sure.
You know, on the top, you've got fun and annoying, and on the left side, you've got no control and control.
Correct. So then to go into the quadrants there, the ones that are annoying that you have no control over, he puts in the box, deal with it, get back on track.
Yeah.
And then he has fun and no control. You might as well enjoy those. You know, if you have a fun distraction that comes along, you can't control it, you might as well enjoy it.
Yep.
Then he gets down to the ones that you do have control over, both annoying and fun versions of those. He indicates that you need to deal with those ahead of time. That's where I think email and such lands.
Yeah, definitely. I want to go back to the fun and no control distractions. He's a big advocate of mindfulness and meditation, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit.
Oh, good.
But I think that this is one of the major benefits of that mindfulness is recognizing that you don't have control over this thing. So yeah, maybe just go along for the ride and enjoy it. This is something that I've struggled with over the years, where if my plans get messed up, I almost like
throw a conniption fit.
Hard to describe myself, but and no one has ever said this to me, but I kind of feel like you can tell on my face that I am incredibly annoyed and you really don't want to talk to me. I'm definitely not enjoying the potentially fun but no control distractions. And I feel like I have made a lot of progress in this area. That was one of the benefits of doing that action item from the last episode, where I made the list of things that I can control and things that I can't control. I'm getting better at recognizing the things that I can't control. And when something does happen that I can't control, don't get bent out of shape about it. Just deal with it or enjoy it, whatever. When it's over, then get back on track. Do what you can to get back into your state of work. Now, that also leads into another distinction here, which is really interesting. He says there's two places that distractions originate. So this 2x2 grid could actually maybe be three-dimensional, but the distractions can originate from ourselves or from others. Now, not all distractions are equal, and I know that there are people who work in a corporate environment, for example, that there's absolutely nothing you can do about the distractions of other people, and you feel like you're just dealing with these one after the other throughout the entire day. Okay, but I think maybe for a lot of people, we tend to make those a bigger deal than they really are. And I'll just speak to myself. I know I've done that. He has an interesting statistic here, though, that when we get interrupted by other people, we get back to work 6 minutes sooner than when we get interrupted by ourselves. So really, we are our own worst enemies when it comes to these distractions.
We're real smart with this, aren't we?
Yeah, but it's easy to project the blame as like, oh, the reason I didn't get anything done today is because Joe in accounting keeps popping into my office. You know,
Joe
it's his fault. It's her fault.
Stop.
Yeah, exactly. It's not my fault. No, I've got my stuff together. I can focus on my work. Well, Chris would say, no, you can't.
Oh, yes. So this is where I have a handful of action items that come from here, because I know that there are quite a few distractions I have throughout the day that I can control that are self-inflicted.
Yep.
And I don't do anything about it. So I keep thinking, oh, I'll do better tomorrow. And then I make it worse.
Exactly.
And it's like, oh, well, I'll get better tomorrow. I wonder how many tomorrows I've wondered if I'll get better.
Yeah, no joke.
I don't think I actually want to know the answer to that.
One other thing from this section, by the way, he talks about the 5 sources of distraction. Okay, so running through these real quickly. Number 1, notifications. Number 2, smartphones. Number 3, emails. Number 4, meetings. Number 5, the internet. Okay. I have mentioned on this podcast that I do not have email on my phone, and occasionally I'll put it back on. As of right now, there is no email on my phone, and I'm taking that even to the next level, which we'll talk about when we get to the action items. But when I read this section, it occurred to me that if you got an email on your smartphone about a meeting, you've checked all 5 of these. So the simple way to reduce all of these distractions is to remove email from your smartphone. Whether you feel comfortable or not doing that, if you really are frustrated with all of these distractions, you can address all 5 of these areas with one swift uninstall action.
You could. I don't really want to, though.
I know. A lot of people are not going to do that, and I get it. You know, it's scary. Even from, well, I guess I'll talk about my action item here. One of the things that he also mentions in this section is to kind of reconsider what your devices are for and how you want to be using them. Okay. So the other day, I was sitting on the couch at night, and I think we were watching a baseball game. And because my 11-year-old, or soon to be 11-year-old, is a big Milwaukee Brewers fan, and this is like the first time they've been in the playoffs in like 8 years. His favorite player is probably going to win the National League MVP, and so it's a lot of fun. But I tend to go to social media during commercials, and he's watching me on my phone, and he makes this comment. It wasn't anything negative to him, but he made a comment because he's always like peeking over my shoulder to see what I'm doing. He's like, "Hey, what you doing?" "Oh, I was just looking at Twitter." He's like, "Oh, you really like to look at Twitter, don't you?" And I was like, "Oh,
that's
caught
the worst." That's the worst.
Yeah. So I have, as of today, deleted all social media off of my phone. I do not have Twitter. I do not have Instagram. I have found myself, since I did that, going to my dock and tapping on the place that Twitterific used to be, and it opens up day one instead.
So now you have to log your feelings.
I'm like, wait, what? Oh.
That's genius, because now you're not only not getting Twitter, you're now bringing up the opportunity to log how you feel about not having social media in day one.
Exactly. It also shows you how much of that is ingrained in your muscle memory. The fact that I'm just going there anyways, even though the app is no longer there. So I get it. And I had a real hard time. I think even on the last episode, I mentioned like, I'm not going to get rid of Twitter. I like Twitter, but it's not worth creating that picture for my kids. I don't want them to think that that's okay, because it's not. If it's an addiction, which it is, because I'm still physically going there to open Twitter,
right?
That's not something I want to reproduce. So I've got to deal with it in my own life before I can tell them, hey, you shouldn't do that. I need to walk the walk before I tell them, hey, this is the way that you're going to use your devices, because they're not old enough to have devices, but I want them, when they do have their own smartphone, tablet, whatever, that they know how to use it appropriately. They're not just using it for consumption, but they're using it to create. They're not just downloading information, but they're intentional about how they're spending their time on those devices. And I've got to live that out before I expect them to.
So some of I think, how many are there? I've got 4 action items from this book, and 3 of them come from this section. No, all 4 of them come from this section. We just haven't talked about the last piece. So with distractions, and one of the things that he talks about in the book is this concept of an hourly awareness chime, and he recommends setting up something to go off on the hour every hour throughout the day, just as an indicator of make sure you're not going into autopilot mode and doing things you shouldn't be doing, or if you are in a distraction, use that as a reminder to come back to your intention for that time. And I'm pretty sure that with all the firefighting and stuff that I normally do throughout a day, that I'm quite terrible at this. So I've been trying to figure out how to do this the right way. I have a dumb watch, and it has that hourly chime ability on it. The problem is, I set that to go off a couple days ago. My wife about lost her marbles with me on this because, and it's silly stuff. I tend to take my watch off at night, and I put it on the counter in the bathroom. Well, our bathroom is right next to our bedroom, and that silly watch would beep beep in the middle of the night. And if it did that at exactly the wrong time, it would wake my wife up in the middle of the night. So she about lost it with me over that one. So I had to turn that off. So I may have to do something like with the Do app or something on my phone to do that. Basically, I need to figure out how I want to do this. But I need some sort of a reminder to help me not just go down the path of distractions like I have a tendency to.
Right.
So
yeah, that the chimes in the middle of the night would drive me crazy too.
I felt bad once she said it, because I'm one of those that would sleep through it and never know it was. I didn't even know it was happening. So yeah, I felt bad for her there. But to go along with the distractions piece, you ever use these distraction blockers on iPhone or Mac at all? iOS or Mac?
I've dabbled with them because I have eliminated email for the most part. That was always the big one for me. It wasn't that I would go to some website and spend a bunch of time there. So the way that they work hasn't really been that beneficial to me.
Sure.
The one place that it would be really beneficial is the smartphone, but it's so sandboxed that it really doesn't help.
Right.
So the solution that I'm at with that is just delete the things.
Okay. I have played around with this just because, and I haven't decided what I want to do. Freedom seems to be a big one, though they've got pulled from the App Store on iOS for who knows, whatever reason Apple decided. But I've played around with that concept on the Mac just because it's too easy for me to get into things on my Mac, and I spend most of my time there. I haven't decided what I want to do with that, so I have it down here as kind of a question mark of sorts. I've been using the screen time bit on my phone, which is kind of helpful. It's too easy to bypass it, to be honest. I could make it harder, but then I might have an actual issue later on. But anyway, so that's one piece. The last I'll bring up here, so email. I have a tendency to use email as a to-do list of sorts. Don't crucify me here. This is one of those things that I know. And yet I realized when I went through this section, and he calls it out, keep an external to-do list. And he's like, well, I have one. It's like, well, I guess I'm not using it the way I should. Whoops. So I took a little bit of time. This was just yesterday to set up some of the shortcuts. I actually texted you about this a little bit, of setting up some shortcuts in my email so that I can get them into OmniFocus easier. So I'm working through some of those details. It doesn't work quite the way I want it to, but I'm on the right path there. So I'm trying to get better about, if I have an email, it's going to take me more than 3 seconds to respond to, getting that out of my email app and getting it into OmniFocus so that I can have the link there. That's what I'm working on to help me get away from that, because there's too much going on in my email. I got to get it out of there.
Right.
Okay, I'll stop now.
Well, that's the eternal struggle for anybody who has actions that they have to take from email is, I already feel overwhelmed, so why should I take the extra time to go send this to a separate task management system when I'm just going to have to come back here and deal with it again later? But then if you just sit there and deal with it, that's how you get stuck doing 6.3 hours of email every day. So I get it. I know when you had texted me, you were talking about custom key bindings in MailMate.
Yes.
To get real nerdy for a second. So MailMate, that's one of the reasons I love MailMate, is that it's so easy to send stuff to the appropriate place. And also why I'm stuck using Evernote for the time being. There's lots of other cool apps out there, like Notion, for example, but they don't have that direct integration with email clients like MailMate that I kind of rely on, because I don't want to just leave the important stuff in there. But also, if you have to go in there multiple times a day, like it's easier to justify not sending it to a task management system. If you have to zero it out every couple of hours, it's a lot easier to say in your head anyways, I don't really need to send this where it should be going, because I'm just going to reply to it shortly anyways. Which
is exactly the habit that I've gotten into. It's like that's the thing that I have struggled with, is that these are things that if I sit down, do the task, it'll take me 4 minutes to complete it and 1 to write the email back. Like, it just doesn't feel like it's worth putting it into OmniFocus, but then it piles up in my inbox, and then I'm just doing the whole emergency scan thing quite frequently, and it's easy to lose things that way. So, between lost items and, clients that have had to contact me multiple times over things because I didn't get back to them, that's why. Whoops.
Yep. And also leaving those things in your inbox, what it really does is it decreases the amount of attentional space that you have for things. I mean, really all of the distractions, that's kind of the net effect of those things, is that they decrease the amount of attentional space that you have. But the other thing that's worth calling out here under the area of hyperfocus is that there are things that you can do to increase your attentional space. Lots of benefits from that, obviously. And he lists these in the book. He talks about how you can plan for the future more, helps you get back on track quicker, you have a better ability to process complex tasks, and you have an increased ability to think about what's coming next while still working on the original intention. So it kind of minimizes that attention residue that I think that was Cal Newport in Deep Work where we first heard about that. But the number one way that you can increase your attentional space, from what I remember reading this section, is to meditate. So, Joe Bulick, how did you feel about this section?
Do I have to answer that question? I have an action item to start meditating again. Somebody should go back and tell me how many times I have done this action item. It's a lot. Part of the reason I put it down here, because, I totally get it. I understand his point. He's been meditating for 10 years, a decade, if I remember correctly. But one of the things that I think I'm starting to come around to is that in a lot of the previous times when I've tried this, I've been in situations where I could control a lot of my day-to-day, and it was pretty easy for me to stay on task. Like I had a lot of the focus ability at the time. But I think what has happened is in the last probably 6 to 9 months, my job duties throughout the day have changed such that I am very scattered and all over the place throughout the day. It's easy for me to get overwhelmed. It's just the way things have morphed. There's enough going on, more so than I'm ever used to. I think maybe the current mindset that I work through each day, I think that has put me in a place where maybe my specific scenario right now would greatly benefit from that, because I don't have the longer stretches that I used to have, and just don't see the issues, or I am seeing the issues that I didn't used to see. So I think there's maybe some, there's potential in this particular scenario, I think. So that's partly why I wanted to try it. Also, I'm getting tired of people telling me how great it is. So I feel like at one of these points, I'm going to understand it. And every time I attempt it, I learn something more about it and see potential in it, but not enough to warrant maintaining it as a habit. So maybe it'll stick this time. I don't know. I'm going to give it another round. No commitments here. I will try it and stay with that.
Well, the framing of meditation as the key to increasing your attentional space in this book is different than anything else I've ever seen when they're trying to convince you that, hey, you should meditate. Because he talks about how one study showed a 30% increase in working memory after only a couple of weeks of daily mindfulness meditation. So you can increase your attentional space by, he's saying, 30% within a couple of weeks by doing mindfulness meditation. That's pretty crazy, especially if you read this section after you've read the first part of this book, where you're talking about dealing with the distractions and you kind of feel like there's no hope, that my
Right.
attentional space is capped at 80 attentional space units or whatever. He's saying no, you can get 30 more in only a couple of weeks by doing this mindfulness meditation. He also, in this book, I forget exactly where, maybe it's later on, where he talks about being well rested and getting enough sleep. When you don't get enough sleep, one of the studies that he mentioned, I think it was from this book, he mentioned that 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation has the same restorative effect for your brain as up to an hour of additional sleep. So there's obviously a lot that happens in your brain from developing this mindfulness meditation habit. And I think when you view it as it's going to provide me this specific benefit, instead of just oh yeah, you might feel more calm or in control or whatever, that's kind of hard to wrap your head around and say, yeah, that's something that I really need to do. It's not quantifiable. But when you say your attentional space. This is how you get things done. This is how you do deep work. This is how you accomplish your important projects. This is how you pay the bills. Then it's a lot easier to justify, I'm going to invest this 10 minutes every day because it's going to buy me back all of this additional time in effectiveness, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I just want to see it.
Right.
I'm at this point, I have the action item because I'm basically saying prove it. Like that's kind of what I'm that's my thinking.
All right. So that is Hyperfocus. And you had mentioned when you were talking about recognizing that you felt scattered, I think is how you put it. The other part of this book is Scatterfocus, but these are definitely not the same thing. So if Hyperfocus is your brain's most productive mode, then Scatterfocus is not emergency scan modality where you're scanning the horizon for the next email you have to respond to right away or the next thing that you have to do. Scatterfocus is kind of your brain taking a break and allowing it to be more creative. Is that fair?
Yeah, this is, I really resonated with this whole section just because what he's calling Scatterfocus, the technicals of what it is, like the how you go about it piece, those are things I've been promoting for a long time. And it involves things like taking breaks and such and collecting dots so that you can connect dots later. Like those are things that I feel like I've been talking about for a long time, but I've never even attempted to formalize it the way that Chris did here. So I was going through this and thought, yes. For once, these are things I do. So I got a little bit of redemption in this particular part of the book. It's like, yes, although I suck at hyperfocus, like I'm really good at scatterfocus, but maybe a little too much so.
Yeah. To be honest, I think you're maybe a little bit too hard on yourself. I think you probably are a lot further than a lot of people when it comes to being able to hyperfocus, just because I've known you for a length of time and I've seen the stuff that you've produced. There's no way you can do that without being able to hyperfocus. But I do get what you're saying. Like you're your own worst critic, and it's easy to focus on the flaws and all the things that you don't do well. And especially when you're talking about hyperfocus, that's kind of like the gold standard that everybody's like, oh, I should be able to do this, but it's really, really hard. And even when you're really, really good at it, it's not something that you do for 8 hours a day. Tan had mentioned at one point that on the concept of deep work, that it's a successful day if he can get 2 hours a day to just do focused deep work for writing or creating or something. And I think that's probably true, but 2 hours out of 24 hours, like what are you doing the rest of the hours? And so that's where Scatterfocus can really help you, because if you're focused on, I'm going to do hyperfocus for this period of time, you can't spend the rest of the time firefighting. You have to use Scatterfocus in order to recharge your batteries. And that's kind of the next point here, but a couple things to point out about Scatterfocus is that it allows you to set intentions and plans for the future. So this is the mode when you're thinking about, like, where do you want to be in 5 years? That's kind of Scatterfocus. It also lets you recharge and it fosters creativity. There's also different styles of Scatterfocus. So when you are out for a walk, for example, and you're capturing ideas, that's capture mode. And that's, he says, best for identifying what's on your mind. There's also a problem crunching mode where and I've talked about doing this, where I'll take my dog for a walk. I won't listen to a podcast. I'll get stuck somewhere and I'll have a problem that I'm trying to solve, and I'll be gone for 15 minutes. And by the time I get back, I've figured out the solution just because I've created the space in order to do that. So Cal Newport would call that a productive meditation, I think is the term that he used. Same kind of idea though, where you're just going to let your brain focus on the problem instead of doing the actual work. And then there's the habitual mode, which is best for recharging and connecting the greatest number of ideas or dots, which is another really cool idea that we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, Scatterfocus, I think, is one that, like, depending on, which mode you find yourself in a lot, the capture mode, the problem crunching mode, or the habitual mode, like, depending on which ones you use, like I've referred to in the past, my interest in maintaining my yard as my own to mow. A lot of people tell me, it's like, well, you can save some time if you just hire that out. It's like, oh, sure, I could. But I get a lot of cool ideas when I'm mowing the lawn. Like there's a lot of value in that. I'm not going to turn on the radio or a podcast on my way to, run some errands, because that's the headspace I need to think through things. Like when I'm doing those things, like that's what I find myself and where I find myself doing this the most. Connecting dots and such. Whenever you are reading books and stuff like what we do, you always come up with new ideas. And I talk to enough clients and new companies and stuff that you kind of get their ideas too. Like, okay, they're going to do X, Y, and Z on their community. I wonder if that would apply. Like, I wonder if Y would work on this over here. And you can start to pull some of those pieces together, but I don't ever really find myself making those connections until I have a chance to go do something that's maybe habitual, like driving to do errands or mowing the lawn. Like, until I get the chance to go do that, those ideas don't really crop up. To me, I feel like the hard part with that is that you can just let your mind wander and let it go wherever, but if you could point it in the right direction and then let it wander, which is kind of counterintuitive when you first say it like that, but if you can give yourself a general direction to let your mind play with ideas, to me, that's where some of the power of this comes in. That's a thing I feel like I've been trying to do for a long time. This whole idea generation process is one that I've been very particular about over the years. So that's the piece of this that I feel like is extremely powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. On the topic of collecting dots, we've mentioned that before. I've mentioned that before in previous episodes of the podcast, because there was that Austin Kleon book that really impacted me when I was struggling with not being able to be creative and recognizing that what you create is really the logical summation of all the dots that you've collected over the years. But there's a whole section in this particular book about how not all dots are created equal, which I really, really liked. One of the things that I jotted down was books are better than Netflix, but he kind of, he's got a powerful visual, I think, which explains this a lot better than a bunch of words can. So again, he's got a graph, and on the y-axis, he's got usefulness, and on the x-axis, he's got entertainment value. And there's kind of this line that slopes downward from the top of usefulness, so that would be like high usefulness, low entertainment. And then he's got dotted lines which break this kind of down into the different tiers. And so you've got things that are highly useful but not very entertaining. Those things are useful. Things that are a little less useful but they are more entertaining are balanced. And then there's things, as you go further away from usefulness and increase in entertainment, you've got entertaining and then eventually trashy. This is an interesting idea because, again, tooting our own horn, but Bookworm is interesting and because it's a combination of both entertainment and usefulness, I would argue. You can get the ideas from these books without having to read the entire book, and hopefully we do it in a way that it's actually fun to listen to. Okay, but those are the ideal dots to collect. And that was one of the things that I wrote down when I read it the first time, was to take stock of everything that I'm consuming. What are the things that I'm listening to? What are the things that I'm reading and watching? And how do I eliminate a couple of the things that maybe are entertaining but not very useful with things that are more balanced? And that's kind of a strategy that Chris advocates for as well. He mentioned specifically like TED Talks, but I think podcasts could fall into that category as well.
Depending on the podcast.
Depending on the podcast, right.
I think I forget who I was mentioning. Maybe this was you, I mentioned it too, but I believe it's the Chinese that have, like, in the U.S., podcasts are primarily for entertainment. Like that's kind of how we use them. We use them as a way to fill in the blanks, I guess, with time. But the Chinese see them as self-improvement, and I think, most podcasts in China are actually paid.
Okay.
So the podcast market has a much higher value in China than it does in the U.S. Kind of weird.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's just a different mentality there, I think. So anyway, that's just a fun little tidbit.
Yeah, I do think that this is a a really powerful idea, though, and it's worth evaluating for everybody, even people who listen to Bookworm, is to take stock of all of the dots that you're collecting. And again, just being intentional, being mindful might be another way to describe it, but recognizing what sort of dots are you collecting. And then there's another idea from this section called clustering, where if there's a specific problem that you're trying to solve, you could just collect a whole bunch of dots around a subject or a topic, and then you apply the scatter focus model and you take a step back and you see all the dots and you see how they're connected. And then just by creating that space for the scatter focus, you're like, oh, that's the solution there. That's the answer that I was looking for. It maybe doesn't appear as like, here's X, Y, Z that you need to do to solve this problem, but you get X from this book over here, and you get Y from this podcast over here, and you get Z from this TED Talk over here, and then you line them all up. And when you have the time to do intentional scatter focus, you can see how those things are connected.
I think this may transition us into the next piece here. But one of the things that I took away from the broader piece of this book is that hyperfocus and scatter focus really need to work together. And although hyperfocus is our most productive way of working, scatter focus is our most creative way of working. And that's a thing that I feel like is very helpful just to understand, is I can go about building my distraction-free mode, and I can go about making sure that I'm getting my hour or 2 hours or 5 hours of focus time in a day if you're superhuman. You can work on doing that, but unless you have this scatter focus habit built in on top of the hyper focus habit, like, neither are really going to thrive. And I think that's the piece. I mean, I think you're being generous in saying that this is maybe something I'm good at. As an example, I don't think I've had a true hyper focus session in at least a few weeks. So like that's that said, this is something that I know that I need to focus on, just because, no pun intended there, but it's something that I need to dedicate a little bit of energy towards developing, because there are things that I can be doing in my workday that aren't email and firefighting. Like, there are some things I can be doing to build into the business for now. So that's a thing that I know that I need to be doing. But if I don't have this scatter focus side of things, I may not have all the ideas I need to do to focus on during that session. So I think it's important to have both, for sure.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I also think, though, that when you bring it back to your ability to hyperfocus, it doesn't just have to apply to your workday. You can apply hyperfocus to the different areas of your life that you, and I don't even want to say set goals in, but the things that are important to you. I would say that you have applied hyperfocus in the way that you deal with your family, because you're cutting out all the distractions. You're leaving your phone in your office before you walk upstairs or whatever. So again, don't be so hard on yourself. But
you're going to stick to this, aren't you?
Well, I think that there's a logical and a natural kind of cadence with this stuff. And you can improve that cadence, you can improve that rhythm when you can apply intentionality for, this is the part of the day I'm going to be doing hyperfocus. When I'm done with that, I'm going to go the other way and do scatter focus. It kind of reminds me of, again, that grid from The Power of Full Engagement, where you're going back and forth between high positive energy, low positive energy, and the goal is to stay away from the negative side. Like, you have to be intentional. You're going back and forth between high positive and low positive. Maybe there's even a direct correlation there between hyperfocus being high positive and scatter focus being low positive. I don't know. But I think that the idea of hyperfocus is something that is more generalizable than just applying it to your work. And I also think that the way Chris describes it in this book as like hyperfocus being the productivity mode or scatterfocus being the creative mode, that's kind of selling it short. I think that when it comes to hyperfocus, I get why he uses the term productivity, because typically you're focusing on how efficiently can I get the tasks on my list done. But I also think that part of productivity is not just cranking out the widgets, but how effective you are. And if the thing that you're working on is creating a blog post, creating a podcast, creating a product, creating a video, like technically that's the creativity mode. But I would argue that a lot of the effectiveness that comes from how clearly you can communicate in that creative outlet is going to be based on the hyper-focus mode. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I could see that. And this is where, like I was kind of referring to it earlier, where you got to have the scatter focus side to really get the ideas, but then you need the hyper focus side to act on it. Like at least that's how I was seeing it.
Yeah. So if you're getting ideas about how to improve your home life and you are applying those, are you using hyperfocus or scatter focus? It's easy to say, well, it's not hyperfocus because I'm not writing X number of words. There's no way to quantify quality time with my kids.
Sure.
But hyperfocus maybe is a skill that does help you be more focused and engaged when you're, I've got 4 boys at home, so we're sitting at home, we're playing Legos or whatever. I don't know what you do with little girls. Maybe you have tea parties. Not quite there yet.
No, they like to jump on dad. We played the pillow game. Yeah, basically I get whacked with pillows.
So maybe hyperfocus allows you to be better at playing the pillow game. Like I think it manifests other ways than just the amount that you produce in work mode.
That's fair, because I'm pretty good at separating. I'm not always the best at staying separated, but I think I follow what you're saying.
Okay. Now, obviously, in this book, I think it's slanted towards the work mode.
Right.
And that's kind of spoken to with the other point here about how they work together, because Chris mentions the biological prime time, which is actually an idea he brings up in the productivity project. And this is all about identifying what is the optimal time to sit down and do hyper-focus type work. So if you can identify that you're most alert, energized, whatever, you can write the most words, you can do the most of whatever thing is producing the most value, then that's when you should hyper-focus for that thing. So maybe it's 10 a.m. It's probably not right after lunch if you go have a big lunch every day. So there is some value in recognizing that, and that kind of lends it to the work context. But like I said, I don't think it's necessarily needs to stay there.
Right after lunch is, prime nap time right there. That's best.
Which is in the section on scatter focus, there's a whole chapter on recharging your attention. And there's a big section in here about sleep. And he mentions on page 166 that for every hour of sleep you miss, you lose 2 hours of productivity the next day. I'm not quite sure. I can't recall how he quantified that specifically. But a lack of sleep leads to feeling more pressure at work. You can focus for a shorter duration of time. You go to social media more often. You have more negative moods. You gravitate to less demanding tasks. You spend more time online. You naturally move in the direction of those distractions.
Yep.
So taking a nap after lunch may be the most productive thing you can do because it sets the boundary and the barrier then for all of the distractions the rest of the day.
I'm going to take a nap, and I'm going to tell my wife that Mike told me to take a nap.
All right.
Can I do that?
You tell her that Mike told you to take a nap because your attentional space is reduced by up to 60% when you don't get enough sleep.
Got a feeling she's going to stare at me when I say that. I'm going to write it in those words. I'm writing it down right now.
All right.
And I'm going to see what she says whenever I write those out or when I say that.
You don't have to nap, by the way, because he mentions in chapter 10 about working together.
Don't backtrack. I was looking forward to that.
Well, you can. There's definitely a lot of value that comes from sleep. But for people who do not want to take a nap, that's also the most effective time for scatter focus is when you have the least energy. He calls that your creativity prime time.
Yes. I think we've covered everything here. Have we hit it all?
I think we got through it all. So go into, I guess, action items?
Yes. You've got at least one here we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah. So I did mention that this one is already done. You can follow up with me in 2 weeks and see if it's stuck. But I've taken social media off of my phone in line with considering how I use my devices. I don't want my smartphone, which is always there, to be so accessible for distractions, even if they're self-imposed distractions. Even if I know that when I go into Twitter, it's a conscious choice I'm making. I'm not responding to a notification because they're turned off. Thank you, Twitter, for eliminating all of the the ability for third-party apps to do that, by the way. makes it easy to do this.
Yeah.
Thanks for making it easier to use your service less. I appreciate that. The other one that I wrote down, though, was in the section on email. And maybe this didn't hit you the same way it hit me because you are maybe naturally doing this with the volume of email you have to respond to. But I like this whole idea of writing emails with 5 sentences or less. I think that as I think about this, it's probably something I tend to be a little bit wordy in my emails. So it's something that I'll struggle with initially. But I obviously see the value in this. The more succinctly you can communicate your points, especially via a text-based medium like email, the better off you're going to be. So this is a challenge that I want to embrace, is clearly communicating what I need to in 5 sentences or less when I respond to email.
Yeah, I can't do this at all.
And it's not going to apply to every email, by the way. I know that there's going to be some emails that it is going to be impossible to do this, but I think this is kind of a cool idea to apply this force constraint to myself when to a lot of the email that I deal with.
I have a lot of clients that, because part of the caveat here is that if you can't say it in 5 sentences or less, you should be making a phone call or, connecting with them in some other medium. I have a lot of people I can't do that with. Like, it's not even an option because of where they're at in the world, or, time zones don't allow us to sync up and such, and it's too much of a hassle to try to get it scheduled, blah, blah, blah. So I have quite a few clients where, I'm sending multiple paragraphs explaining something. I try to make sure I'm as succinct as I can be, and detailed as I can be, but doing it in 5 sentences and conveying what I need to convey, that's just not going to happen in most cases.
So maybe the exception then is 5 sentences outside of a text expander snippet.
That could be. I have a ton of text expander snippets for this sort of thing. But I will say that if it's not like an explanation and then just like conveying that something was done or what needs tested and such, those are almost always 2 or 3 sentences and they're done. So, a lot of those are very, very quick, but I have quite a few in a day that are quite lengthy. I think at one point I had a logger. It's been a while since I've done this, but I had a key logger at one point that was telling me that I was typing on average 35 to 40,000 words in a day.
Jeez.
Which is nuts. Like, that's half a book. So it's a lot. But anyway, yeah, 5 sentences or less. Kudos to you. I can't commit to that, but I'm sure you're gonna have a few that don't convert to that.
Yeah, I like that being the goal, though.
Yeah, it's a good one. I like it, though. I've got 4 here, and I think I've mentioned these all, but I'm working on the hourly awareness chime, just as a reminder to pay attention to what it is I'm doing right now. I'm looking into distraction blockers. Not sure if that's actually going to stick or not, but it's something I at least want to explore. Don't use my email as a to-do list. And I even wrote in parentheses here, I know, I get it. And then lastly, meditation. And again in parentheses, it hurts to say this again. Yeah. Anyway, there we are. That's what we got.
All right. Author's style and rating.
This will be fun. Considering, like, as we're recording this, we're getting ready to go into the interview with Chris. So this will be fun.
Right. You want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. So I really like Chris's style. I think that this is honestly a much more approachable book on the topic of focus than a lot of the stuff that is out there. Chris is really, really smart. He's read a lot of the same research papers that a lot of the other people have. He references Mihaly on page, what page was that? Page 20 something, page 21. Yeah.
It's a requirement.
But he distills it down into some really simple mental models. There's a lot of diagrams in this book which help me anyways kind of solidify these concepts in my head. Whereas a lot of other books might just talk around these topics because there's a lot of things that he covers in here. from habits to meditation to obviously focus is like a big thing, creativity, biological prime time, sleep. Like there's a ton in here, but it's easy to see how it all works together. And so this is not, I don't think, and this is just because I've read a lot of books. If this was like the first focus book I picked up, maybe I would think that this was just absolutely amazing. But I think it's really, really good. I don't think it's on the same level. Kind of like I said about the Sean Achor book. It's not, when I compare it against like Man's Search for Meaning, I can't rate it a 5.
Yeah.
But I think it's really, really good. And I think for somebody even who's been in the productivity space for a long time, there's a lot of stuff that you'll get from this. But for somebody who maybe this is their first productivity book, their first book on focus, deep work, whatever, this is a great place to start. I will definitely be recommending this book to just about everybody. And I'm going to rate it 4.5.
Nice. That's exactly where I was going to go. So 4.5, yes, times 2. And I will agree that, Chris is, he's really good at writing for sure. So kudos there. At the same time, I feel like there's a lot of tidbits that you can get out of this and a lot of action items that come with it, but it also doesn't hit that Man's Search for Meaning level. Good point there. So yeah, I think 4.5 is a good place to put this one.
Cool. Upcoming books.
Yeah, so the next one up is my choice, and I have selected Predictably Irrational by Dan O'Reilly. And I think I talked about this just slightly last time, but the tagline here is the hidden forces that shape our decisions. It's a New York Times bestseller, notable book in the New York Times, book review of the year sort of thing. I have the revised and expanded edition. I didn't realize that until I started reading it a couple days ago. So we'll see how that works. It's over 300 pages, so this is kind of a big one. Yeah, sorry about that.
Got to get busy. All right, the one after that is my choice, and I went to the Bookworm Club for this one, and I looked at which book had the most votes, and it is indeed Scrum by Jeff Sutherland. So we're going to be doing that one after Predictably Irrational. This is a book that I have read previously. Have you read this?
I have not. It's been on my list for quite a while, though.
Okay. So this is already, I'll tell you, because I've mentioned it on other podcasts, that this is a good book. And I think this is going to be interesting to see how, as we're reading this for Bookworm, this applies to a non-work context.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to go through it with you.
Yeah, that'll be fun. I don't have a Gap book this time.
No Gap books for Joe. Okay. Though I do have a Gap book, and it is the new book by the Basecamp guys. It's called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. So Jason Fried and I forget the other guy, the guy basically who wrote Ruby on Rails,
Yep.
if I remember right. This is so they've written a couple books like Remote and Rework was the other one that really impacted me several years ago when I read it. This is kind of in that same vein. So it's a lot of like really short couple page chapters, if you want to call them that, on specific topics. But so far, it is really well done.
David Heinemeier, I think is the name you're looking for.
Yep. I just wasn't going to try to pronounce that.
I live in the Rails world, so yes. Go David.
Yeah, I knew you knew who he was.
Fun times.
All right. So if you want to recommend a book, you can do so at club.bookworm.fm. And like I mentioned, I picked Scrum. That's the one that's got the most votes at the moment. So that would be the place to go to recommend a book for yourself. You can also go to the website, bookworm.fm/list, I believe. Gives you a list of all of the books that we have covered and all of the upcoming books as well.
And if you like the show, there's a couple ways that you can help us out. One is leave an iTunes review. Link in the show notes for that. 2, you can click on any of the links in the show notes for the books. Those are Amazon affiliate links, so those give us a little bit of a kickback if you are interested in the books and decide to pick them up. If you use our links, we get a little bit of a kickback from that. So that's a second way you can support the show. Third, you can join the club. So club.bookworm.fm, again, link in the show notes. That is where we have conversations about all of these episodes. If you have action items from the books, or you're curious about certain ones, or have a book that you want to recommend, that's all done on the club. So join the club and share your thoughts.
Yeah, and I want to call out specifically an iTunes review. So Martin LTPM rated it 5 stars, said excellent. He says, good coverage of books. I may even purchase 1 or 2 that I've passed on before, and gave some very constructive criticism, which I apologize because he mentioned that we overuse the words quote unquote and actually, and I know that I did that at least a couple of times this episode. But this is awesome. I love this. So thank you for sharing this, because this is the big benefit I got from joining Toastmasters. Pretty much overnight when I joined Toastmasters, I stopped saying I know I still say it occasionally, but compared to where I was when I first started going to Toastmasters, it's night and day difference. And all it was somebody pointing out that you tend to say this all the time.
Yeah.
So this is really, really good. I love this, and I'm going to do everything that I can to stop overusing these buzzwords. So thank you for the feedback. Thank you for the rating. And if you are following along, the next book is Predictably Irrational. So we will talk to you in a couple of weeks. So Chris Bailey, welcome to Bookworm.
Thanks for having me, man. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So the way this is going to go, this is going to be slotted in with a normal Bookworm episode where we actually dove into the content of your book already. So what we wanted to do for this segment is kind of talk about something that's probably a little bit more interesting to our listeners anyway. And I know as we were talking about before we hopped on the call, that maybe is more interesting for you too, because you tend to talk about the content in a lot of different places. So what we want to do here is kind of talk about the process and really where you got the idea for the book, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's kind of like it's a curious part about publishing a book, because when the book comes out, you will have read it 4 or 5 times if you go through the traditional publishing route. And so you're familiar with the content, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm ready to get this out into the world. Then you start talking about it in various media outlets. And I'm fortunate that my publisher is good, and the contacts that I have are good, and people are interested in my work, so that I get a bunch of interviews around the book. But you're right that it is the same questions coming up again and again and again, multiple times a day often. And so it's nice to talk about the process, because I'm sure a lot of the folks that are listening are nerds about the process of creating anything. It's just so curious, because you have this end product, this hardcover book that I'm holding in my hands right now. But how does this come into fruition when it starts as an idea in somebody's mind and turns into something that you can throw down on your desk and crack open and start flipping through the pages? So it's so fascinating, because I remember being fascinated about this idea before I started even thinking about writing a book. And so I learned the lessons the hard way with the first book, and then wrote a second book using the lessons that I'd learned from writing the first one. So it's fascinating. And so hopefully, it's interesting, but it also helps people if somebody's considering writing a book that's hardcover, that's whether it's traditionally published, whether it's self-published, regardless of how it's published, thinking through these ideas, and it should be fun.
One of the things that I see a lot with these books, and Mike and I have been teasing about this a lot for how many episodes now, Mike, but it seems like most books are structured where they've got 3 parts. And in this particular book, I could see you were trying to get away from that, because there's part 1 and part 2, but then you have this chapter 0 concept that's in there, which is very interesting to me. And I'm very curious, how did that come about, and how did you discover the structure for this book?
Do you follow Merlin Mann's work?
Oh, yeah.
At all?
I think most people in our space do, it seems like.
I remember listening to maybe on MacBreak Weekly a long time ago, and he used to say step 0 all the time. And so I thought, I'm going to have a chapter 0 in this book, because it's not really a chapter 1. It's kind of like a preface to the book itself, kind of like a story that frames the book. And then there's kind of the tactics after that set you up to read the book. So how to focus better on reading Hyperfocus, which is chapter zero point 0.5. And funny enough, when we were pitching this book around to different publishers, we met with a lot of editors, and it turned out, this is like so inside baseball, but I feel there's a few nerds out there who might be curious about this story. I was just chatting randomly with my editor, and I saw him on Twitter. Then I saw that he followed somebody by the name of John Siracusa. And I saw that he followed somebody else by the name of Marco Arment and a few other people in the Apple tech space. And he published a few books with Guy Kawasaki and Ray Kurzweil and other kind of nerds like that. And so I thought, like this guy, he's down with technology, and he'd be totally game for this. And it turns out that he was. Another reason for the Chapter Zero, in addition to kind of that muted Merlin Mann ism, is Goodreads. I like to update my page count in Goodreads whenever I'm reading a book, but it pisses me off. Sorry for swearing, you might have to bleep that out, but it really bugs me whenever I encounter the preface of the book and they use Roman numerals as like the page numbers. And so when you type in your page number count on Goodreads, you don't get credit, because only when you start the book, that's when page 1 occurs. And so that, man, I'm not going to, for the 3 people that read my book that struggle with the same thing, I don't want them to go through that as well. So yeah, it's kind of like a nerdy reference in a way that most people won't get, and everybody, I feel a lot of people might look at it and think, because most of my readers aren't tech nerds, they're everyday people that walk by the book in the bookstore. But I feel a lot of people might think it's a mistake, but now we know the truth.
I didn't catch the Merlin Mann reference, but I did really like the way that, you wrote this book on focus, and in chapter 0.5, you're explaining, for people who would have trouble reading this book, here's a couple things you can do to focus to read this book on focus.
Yeah.
Little meta, but I thought that was brilliant.
Well, that's kind of the odd thing about productivity books, is that the people who need them the most are the people who are the least likely to pick up a book about productivity. Like, it's a book about focus. It's not that we don't have time to read. It's that we don't have the attention to read. And so my intention with that chapter was like, okay, how can I maximize the odds that somebody's actually going to make it through this thing so that it helps them improve their lives? Because that should be the intention when you write a book, is how do you make somebody's life better? Because if you make their life better, they're going to tell people about your book, and then the effects will cascade from that point. That's what I really believe. And so, yeah, it's just like, okay, how do I maximize the odds of this?
Well, that's great. I like I said, I really like that part of it. Now, you mentioned you learned several lessons between Productivity Project and Hyperfocus. Maybe we can come back to those lessons specifically. But how'd you get the idea for Hyperfocus after the Productivity Project? What was the process there where you landed on, this is the thing for my next book?
The Productivity Project, it kind of, I did a year of productivity experiments. I learned a lot, kind of looking at all the research about the topics. I thought, that's enough for a book. And a bunch of agents approached me after the project was done. And that led to a deal to write the book with Penguin Random House. But, the second book, I didn't, it's kind of like the first one in a way, where I didn't begin the productivity project, what was then called a year of productivity, thinking, I want to write a book about productivity by the time this year is done. I think the second book was kind of the same, where, I thought, if I'm going to write a book, I want it to be something that I'm very, very curious about, and something that I struggle with myself. And that was really the impetus of writing Hyperfocus, was that I noticed how distracted I was as somebody who's a pretty big nerd about productivity. And so I thought, okay, maybe if this is something that I struggle with, maybe it's something other people struggle with too. And maybe if I struggle with it, but yet I'm giving advice that we should resist distraction, maybe there's a part of the bigger picture that I'm missing here with the book. And so it was really at that point where I thought, maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something here that not only could help other people out, but could help me out in the process. And so, whereas the first book, it was kind of the natural next step after doing a year of productivity experiments and looking at the research. But, the second project was born out of necessity in a way that the first one wasn't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And it seems like it's a natural progression there. That was one of the things, I know you weren't privy to it, but Mike and I were going through the book in a lot of detail right before we jumped on here. And one of the things that we talked about is how the Productivity Project is very insightful into your experiments, and it serves as a really nice high-level overview of everything you really need to know about productivity, whereas this kind of focuses on one aspect within that, but it's one of the most important aspects.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to see, like, okay, well, you needed to write this. It needed to be the next step. So it's very interesting how those two fit together.
And I'm not somebody who kind of like thinks, okay, what's the next step in my career? And maybe a book about focus is marketable. And then I'm gonna find a way to write a book about focus. It really does start from that place of something that I struggle with. And it very much was a project, just like the Productivity Project, but most of it was invisible. So immediately after encountering this lesson, I started looking at all the studies I could find about the topic. And I feel a lot of people say they read a study from front to back, but they don't actually do. Most people are kind of BSing when they say they do that, because studies can be very dry and very boring. So they have to be, you have to be curious enough about exploring the depths of an idea if you want to pursue connecting information about that topic. And so I started poring over. Luckily, I hope nobody ends up telling the school this, but my fiance, she's studying for her PhD, and so I get free access to all of her university's studies. So I get access to all the study portals, so I don't have to pay $20 or $30 a pop. And so I just I started pulling and printing off and connecting all of these different pieces of information until I discovered an iPad app called Papership, which allows you to read these things digitally and highlight them digitally. So I wasted a ton of paper unnecessarily. But it got to the point where I had accumulated around 25,000 words of notes about this topic that was pure research. And so I think this is something that not enough people think about when they write a book, is how dense do you want the book to be? Because, you see this a lot with books in the productivity space, where there'll be one little bit of science and then a big, long anecdote that is a waste of everybody's time that just exists to fill some word count. And so I think that's something that not a lot of people consider. I made a few notes before the call because I was kind of thinking through, how I used, what consideration went into structuring the book. And, one of them was that I didn't want 3 parts. I wanted just 2, the 2 attentional modes of our mind. But another big consideration was, okay, how dense do I want this book to be? And the book ended up being about 70,000 words. And so I collected about 25,000 words of scientific research that the book is based on top of. And so it's not one little bit of science followed by 10 pages that you have to wade through of anecdotes. It's much more concentrated than that. You get the odd example, you get the story very, very occasionally, which backs up and supports the science that you want to get across to people, because you need to make it digestible in some way as opposed to just rhyming off a bunch of statistics. But I think that's kind of the key, is how dense do you want the book to be? What proportion of a book do you want to be science? Do you want to be tactics? Versus what proportion of it do you want to be examples and stories and, just stuff like that? And I don't think enough people consider that ratio before they write a book, but I think this is something that separates the best books that I've read, or my favorite books that are in this science help space, from the ones that are my least favorite, is the density of them.
Yeah. Regarding your fiance's research access, don't worry, your secret is safe with us. It's just you, us, and the rest of the internet.
Oh, okay. Nobody will hear this from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario.
Right. I do want to ask you a question, because the Productivity Project was based off of a bunch of experiments that you did. Mm-hmm. And this book is based off of a lot of research on a particular topic. Was it difficult for you going from I'm going to be a guinea pig to I'm going to be a thought leader on this topic.
Oh man, don't call me that.
Well, the reason I bring it up is that I think a lot of people deal with this imposter syndrome. I know I deal with it, where it's like, who do you think you are saying this stuff? Because you mentioned like you did all this research, you started this project because it was something that you dealt with. So how did you overcome that, or what was the process there before you felt comfortable attaching your name to, hey, these are the ideas that are going to make a positive impact in your life?
I honestly didn't really think about that too much. It felt like a more, if I can be a bit candid, like a growing up project where, I conducted all these, I still continue to conduct experiments on myself because, they're very much a way by which you can, they're kind of a vehicle to make productivity more attractive and marketable to a general audience, because it makes it interesting. Instead of talking about the science of meditation, if you tell people a story of, I meditated for 35 hours over the course of a week while working outside of the boundaries of that experiment, it's a great vehicle through which to communicate what you want to get across with the research. And so, I did conduct a few with the book, like, Living in Boredom for a month and, one or two others. But I think the research itself was a sort of experiment in my eyes. So I guess it wasn't really that big of a jump. The experiment was digging through the research and getting to the bottom of what is it that makes our attention tick. And so from that research, the structure of the book sort of presented itself. I didn't come into it with a lot of preconceived notions about the way our attention works. So I didn't, so that allowed me to be surprised throughout the process, like from ideas like that. Sometimes being interrupted is a really good thing. Sometimes not blocking distractions is good, especially if we're more anxious people, because it just stresses us out more and it decreases our heart rate variability and things like that. And so I think starting from the research and using that as a sort of experiment and connecting all of that, it was sort of one experiment as opposed to a couple of dozen, but it wasn't that different in my eyes.
That makes sense. So what was the hardest part about writing this particular book for you?
That's a good question.
Good luck.
Yeah. I can't, let me just flip through the table of contents here. I can't really say that there was a part of it that was that difficult. Just kind of looking through it. Maybe perhaps the difficult part was I do a lot of talks and lectures for just, random stuff. I speak at companies and conferences and things like that. And so finding the attention around those projects, writing on airplanes and in airports and in diners before and after talks, talks, they consume more attention than they do time. You speak for an hour on a stage, or at least I do, and you spend a few days thinking about it. And so it's hard to write in those few days leading up to a presentation when you're thinking about doing a good job and hopefully being helpful during the talk itself. So I think that was the challenge more so than anything. When I had the time to write, it came pretty naturally, but because I had a structure for the book ahead of time, I don't think this is something enough people do when it comes to writing a book. So I had the 25,000 words of research notes. Then, I came up with a structure that sat on top of that research. So I maneuvered the notes around, and this took several months to kind of shape them and mold them with my hands into something that was more of in the shape of a book that I would want to read myself. But once that happened, and once the research notes were there in kind of a structure, a framework that I liked, it sort of wrote itself. I think this is a big mistake that people make with writing, is that they don't consider the structure of a bigger project before they begin writing it. But when you have that structure, you're able to then make connections and so think, okay, this idea that I wrote about in chapter 2, that's relevant in chapter 4, and I can reference this, and it's connected with this idea in chapter 7. In this chapter 10, we can draw back, and you can begin to see the connections, as opposed to just writing it on the fly and not having any of this high-level perspective of the structure of the book. Because there's kind of like, in my eyes, and I think a lot about the process of creating something, there's kind of two levels of a book. There's, it's like the forest and the trees. There's the ground level structure where, it's sentence structure, it's making things flow, it's being able to explain things, it's, leaning on the science whenever possible. And then there's kind of the broader architecture of the book, where you want it to be structurally sound. You want it to be, in this case, I spent a good amount of time making the book symmetrical. And so you'll see that in chapter, or in parts 1 and 2, part 1 has 5 chapters, part 2 has 5 chapters, then you have the kind of sandwich with the acknowledgments at the end, and chapter 0 and point 5 at the beginning. And so I think this is something that made the process incredibly natural, was having that structure ahead of time, so that for a couple of months after that structure was defined and we were pitching it around to different publishers to see who wanted to publish it, there was that period of time, that incubation phase, where the thoughts, as I scattered my attention, one of the ideas in the book, I was able to connect the various chapters with one another to make it more succinct and maybe to eliminate some redundancy at the same time.
Chris, one of the things that I find myself noticing, and I don't bring it up a lot on Bookworm, but every once in a while I'll notice something that is of interest to me. But in this particular case, since I have you here, like this makes it easy. But you did this small experiment that you talk about in the chapter on taming distractions, and you did this 30-minute process where you just let your mind go and wrote down all the things that you ended up doing.
Yeah.
Which was like bouncing around Twitter and Reddit and, news websites, your other Twitter, email, Amazon and such. But you made this interesting little side note when you mentioned Reddit, that the specific subreddit was about mechanical keyboards.
Yeah.
And Mike is a clicky keyboard fan. I have been considering diving into this world.
Yeah.
How long have you used a mechanical keyboard? Which one are you using? I'm very curious now.
Oh my gosh.
So thanks for this little side note.
Yeah, this little tangent that, honestly, we could do an entire show about clicky keyboards. I started off with a cherry blue keyboard.
That's your next book.
Yeah. Oh God, man. Talk about a career shift that, like, you want to think of a book that isn't marketable. I think one on mechanical keyboards will sell all of like a half a dozen copies. But actually, that might be a curious deep dive into this world. In my eyes, and I've explained it this way once or twice before, so forgive me, dear listener, if you've heard me mention it. But in my eyes, I have a piano in my office, and most people have played one of those keyboards where there's no weight to it, where you just kind of push down on a button, and that button is shaped like a piano key, and then it flips a digital switch somewhere, which triggers some bits to play a sound out of the speakers on the keyboard, which is just kind of like a MIDI file or a WAV file in some software program on the computer where they just minimize the latency to make it sound okay. And the difference between a mushy non-mechanical keyboard and a mechanical keyboard is one that I think is the equivalent of going from one of these plain old keyboards, the piano keyboards, to a grand piano. So you feel the weight. You know that when you push down on one of the keys, because it's a string instrument, it hits a string in the back, which you then hear. There's a beautiful simplicity and elegance and richness to that sound and to that experience. You know that you're more connected with what you're doing. And I would make the argument that the exact same thing is true when you go from a traditional keyboard to a mechanical keyboard. So there's all kinds of different switches. Some of us like cherry the main two are cherry blues and cherry browns. So cherry blues, I find they have an aggressive sound. When you push down on one, it's like you're pushing down on a tiny little spring that collapses, and it gives more feedback when you actuate the key switches, and so it's louder, and it pisses off your roommates and the people that you live with a bit more if you want to be passive aggressive about it, which is another underrated benefits of mechanical keyboards. but the cherry blue switches are a bit too crispy for my taste. Yeah, I hear it and I think no, that that's. But I'm a big fan of the cherry brown. So think brown like chocolate. It's a bit smoother. It's richer. It's more of a luxurious sound. In my opinion, it's an upgrade from the cherry blues. I think a lot of people don't realize what they're missing because they buy a cherry blue keyboard and they type on it. They enjoy the mechanical keyboard life, and then because that's the default with most of these keyboards, they don't get to experience a different kind of key switches. There are key switch samplers where you buy it and it has.
I've got one right here.
You've got one. So you've got what do you got? The green, you got the clear, the brown, the blue, the black.
Yep, the red and the clear. Yeah. So here's the blue you were talking about.
Yeah.
And then here's the brown.
Oh yeah.
It's a lot less clicky.
Oh yeah, I will say that there's a Logitech gaming keyboard. I don't like the look of it, so I didn't buy it. But it's one of my favorite. I forget the name of the key switches that they use, but it's a mechanical keyboard. And go to an office supply store and you can feel it out. And I think that's an underrated one, but I don't know what the key switches are called. But it's like going from. It's just upgrade, especially if you write a lot, if you do a lot of typing throughout the day. It's such a luxurious way of using a computer.
Totally agree. So which keyboard do you use? Do you use the Logitech one?
I've got the DOS keyboard with the cherry brown switches. In Canada, you can't order it online. And I went to the store and they had the DOS keyboard because I needed the Mac layout and I needed the cherry browns instead of the blue. So it was two customization options. I think it took a month or two maybe they had to use a dog sled or something to get to my part of Canada. But it finally came, and I upgraded from. Oh man, I forget the name of the other keyboard. I think it was a DOS keyboard as well. Just because DOS has the Mac layouts, and there's a beautiful volume slider too, which has a great knob feel, which I'm a big fan of.
I've got a DOS keyboard that I got blank keycaps on.
Oh really? You're a blank
part of a productivity experiment. The goal was to see if I could train myself to be a touch typist and improve my words per minute. And the too long didn't read version is that yes it did.
Oh really? I just grabbed the other ones. Yeah. Oh man, yeah. This takes me back. Yeah. Also, the font on this isn't as nice. It's kind of it's like a more intense version of Roboto on Android. So I'm a big fan of the DOS keyboard. Anyway.
Yeah.
There you go.
Tangent.
Thanks for that. I've been very curious. I've been playing around with buying one of these things for a while. I've been looking at the DOS keyboards. So
yeah, you just cost Joe some money.
To go that route. You did.
I would pony up for one of those switches so you can just fiddle with it for a bit and
sure.
Because I feel it's very subjective.
Yeah, get the key tester, Joe.
Yeah.
I may have to do that. I do a lot of writing, mostly through emails, it seems like, but yeah.
So, Mike, did you buy one of the testers and then buy a keyboard, or did you go the other way?
No, I bought a keyboard and then heard John Gruber talk about the key tester and decided to buy one. But it's a fun dust toy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. What's your favorite after having it there?
Well, I have the cherry blues on my DOS keyboard. I have a code keyboard in front of me, which I got through a mass drop, which has the clears. But I think that you're right. The browns feel the best to me.
I hear that from the most people, but it's so funny that the blues are the default. Maybe the browns are costlier to manufacture. They can't get the scale going enough. But I think I would recommend for people who don't want to pick up the tester to just go for the browns.
So did you write a good chunk of your book then on this clicky keyboard that you have?
Yeah, the productivity project was written on cherry blues, and Hyperfocus was written on cherry browns.
Nice.
I love that.
Maybe you could feel the difference.
Yeah. What were some of the lessons that you learned from writing the productivity project that you did things maybe differently when you wrote Hyperfocus? Because you mentioned that near the beginning of the episode here.
I think one of the keys was really having a well thought out structure. Kind of inside baseball, when we pitched the productivity project, it was originally pitched as a book called the Productivity Playbook. We pitched it around to different publishers, and so the one publisher came back and said, yeah, we want to publish it, but our idea is to publish it as the Productivity Project and have something that's more narrative based. And so the proposal, and when you have a book proposal that you're pitching different publishers on, about half of it, so that it's 40, 50 pages, about half of it is the detailed table of contents of the book itself. And the other half is kind of a marketing plan, because they want to know who reads your stuff. They want to know how much of an audience you have, and that you're going to be able to generate enough of a push to get the book out into the world. And in the detailed table of contents for the first book, it was written in 50 chapters because it was more of a tactical book, the productivity playbook. Each chapter was its own kind of tactic. And in the end, in the final book, it ended up being 25 chapters long. And so I feel that was like a big jump and a big lesson learned from the first book, was that the more time you spend on crafting a detailed table of contents that can be expanded to a book, the more that the finished book will end up looking like the detailed table of contents and what you originally set out to write in the first place. And so I look at the proposal for Hyperfocus, and the finished book is virtually identical to the one that was in the proposal. And, I'm fortunate that each of the editors that I've had that looked at, that acquired both of the books, they were like, okay, we trust you, run out, do a good job, and come back and we'll see how it goes. And so, it wasn't really a limitation from that side of the spectrum. It was very much that my thinking was more concrete with Hyperfocus. Another big thing was having a target word count for each chapter. And this was one of my favorite parts about putting together the research is, say for the first chapter, there were 5,000 words of research notes that I had gathered. And for the second chapter, I had 10,000 words of research notes that I'd gathered. And let's say, for the sake of argument, the book is just 2 chapters long. Then I could then define a target word count for each chapter that is related proportionally to how many words of research notes that I had accumulated for the chapter, so that the density of the book overall could stay about the same. And so, say the first chapter would be 20,000 words long, and the next chapter would be 40,000 words long. And so it was a way of kind of maintaining that density so that the greater, broader architecture of the book was consistent from chapter to chapter. And so I think it was very much having that framework in which to write, learning from the first book and then jumping over to the second book, that really helped create a product that, and this is not to throw the first book under the bus by any stretch of any measure, because I am extraordinarily proud of how it turned out. But when you get a book,
we liked it.
Yeah. People seem to like it. But the thing about getting a book deal is that when you get the deal, you wait for somebody to tell you how to write the book. And then you realize that nobody's going to tell you how to write the book. You have to turn the idea that's in your mind into something that's 80,000 words long. How do you think on that scale? How do you connect ideas on that level? And so what you end up doing is you kind of, you work really hard, you get a bit stressed out when the deadline approaches, and you hopefully end up with something at the end that you're proud of. But, that was kind of the wonderful thing about writing book number 2, is having all of those lessons and learning how to sort of pace myself in the writing process. This was kind of another fun thing that I did over the course of the writing process, is the target word count that I had was 70,000 words for Hyperfocus. It was about 80,000 words for the productivity project, but I figured I wanted it, again, to be a bit denser, not in a bad way, but in a more way of being respectful of somebody's time, so they don't have to wade through a lot of stories and stuff. And so what I did on this level was have kind of a trend line in my office. And so every few days, especially after I'd written a bit, I would print off a chart that had two lines on it. There was one line that had a consistent slope where on the left was 0 words, on the right was 70,000 words, and it went up over time. Over, on the bottom axis, that was the deadline that I had, the days leading up to it, and on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, was the word count, how many words I'd written. And then every few days I would update that chart so that there was another line that danced around that pacing line. So I knew if I was ahead of pace or behind pace, and I would always try to be above that line. Sometimes I'd dip a bit below if I had a few talks, but then I'd realize, okay, I need to get my stuff, my affairs in order here because my next month is really booked up. And so I need to write a lot when I can to be above that pacing line. It's a wonderful way of doing any project that's longer term, in my opinion. Losing weight or body fat, it's another wonderful way where you have that trend line, and so you can see your progress relative to that. So you can reward yourself along the way, but you can also know when to hunker down and get rid of all the potato chips in your house. I think you need to do something with, something similar with the long-term writing projects that you have too, especially when it's something that's so big, 70, 80,000 words. So breaking it down on that chapter level in a way that's consistent with the density of the content that I wanted to have, as well as having that pace overall, I think is something that really helped the end product.
Yeah, that is great advice.
This is something I've talked to Mike a couple times about is, when we go through these books and we're trying to give a kind of a synopsis of what the book is about, but then also trying to offer our opinions about it. And one of the things that we've played around with is trying to, and we talk about it a little bit when we talk about like author style and how easy it is to read and stuff, but there's certain books that I feel like should have been an article, like a blog post of sorts. Like give me a 1,500 word synopsis. Yeah. That would have been a much better use of everybody's time.
Yeah.
As opposed to writing this, 60, 70, 80, 100,000 word, exposition on a topic that you could have covered in 1,500 words. So I am grateful that you thought this through when you put this book together.
Honestly, it's not something that enough people think through. And I know this for a fact because when I speak with the editors that I have, so I have different editors in different countries. So, I have a Canadian editor, a UK editor, and of course the main US editor and editors around the world where the translations are published. And the number one problem they tell me whenever they look, these are all acquisitions editors. So, they edit the book for content and, to see, they know what resonates with the end reader, but they also actually buy the books on behalf of the publishers. And the number one challenge that they say is feeling out whether an idea is bigger than an article, that whether an idea is book-sized or whether it's the size of a long article that might be in the Atlantic or the Guardian or one of these long-form media pieces. And so it's a challenge that I think everybody in the industry faces. And I think one of the reasons why when you pitch a book to various publishers, they ask for that detailed table of contents so they know what's going to be in the book and so that they can feel out on that more granular level whether a book is going to be a bit shorter or a bit longer. I think this is, now that you mentioned that, something that I had a greater amount of awareness about when it came to the second book. I don't know if the first book could have been 50 chapters in hindsight because it's so hard to feel out that density not having gone through the process in the first place. But having gone through it once and feeling out that some of the chapters that I would have tried to write would have just been a few paragraphs unless I tried to extend them in an unnatural way just by adding stories. It's a fascinating consideration. And it's so difficult to feel out how big of an idea something is. But, I had such a gift in writing Hyperfocus in that I sat on such a mountain of research that supported the ideas that I wanted to write about. So, when you have that research, the 25,000 words of research notes, and you add the tactics on top of that through which we can become more focused and productive when we do the tactics, which are connected to the research, the book is kind of, that natural length of 70 to 80,000 words. 70 to 80,000 words is it's about 220, 250 pages. So the length of a regular kind of nonfiction book that's published in the business space, depending on, character spacing and the font that's used, and how many kind of asides there are in the book and how many chapters there are, because that determines how many breaks there are in pages as well. So yeah, it's a fascinating consideration, and I think this is something that more people should consider when they write a book. And it's another reason, just yet another reason, to do that detailed table of contents. When I wrote the Productivity Project, I did not want to make a detailed table of contents. I just wanted to write the frickin' book. But I think this detailed table of contents is what made it possible to write a book in the first place. And it's a step everybody wants to skip, because you think, when I was in college, I wrote a bunch of essays, and they always said, do the structure before, but it's, I don't need to. I just wrote the essay and I got a good grade. Well, if you don't make that when you're writing a book, the book is going to flop unless you're writing fiction. You need to have that structure ahead of time for the book to be well thought out and to respect people's time, frankly, because there's so many books out there that don't care about the reader. The author is in the center of the book, not the reader. And so I think that's kind of another skill that at least I try to develop is, thinking, okay, what will help the reader out the most? Every reader's different, of course, but what can I write about that will help somebody out when they sit down to read it? And it's I think that's another key when you're writing this stuff too.
That's great stuff. Thanks, Chris. I know you got to get out of here. So before you go, is there anywhere else that you would want to send people to connect with you? Obviously, we're going to have a link to the book in the show notes, but anywhere else that people can go find out more about you and what you're up to?
My site is called The Life of Productivity. You can look at my books. The newest one is called Hyperfocus: How to Be More Productive in a World of Distraction. And the first one is called The Productivity Project. And they're both something that I'm proud of. And, I just find it so fun to nerd out about the process behind creating things. We didn't even chat about how I wrote each of the two books in TextEdit. The entire book.
We need another half hour, I think.
That.
It's, TextEdit is, I think, the most underrated application on the Mac. I write everything in it. I even have, it's like a bit of custom code. I think it's like a shell script where, you select a bit of text. I press Command, Alt, Control, C. I get, Command, Alt, Shift, Control, C. And I get a little script that counts all the amount of words in a document. So I have so many of these little hacks. But the outlining mode in TextEdit, I think, is one of the most underrated features. So if you go into TextEdit and you press Alt Tab, you get a bullet. Then you can start typing, then you press Enter, and then you do Tab or Shift Tab to go back a tab. And it's so easy to select text, and it's so freaking easy to write in the app and select text and bold it and make it bigger. And I think this is something that not enough people do, is, just get out of your own way. You don't need a fancy app. You just need, WordPad or TextEdit, because the idea should be in your head, not in the application.
Oh my gosh, that is such great advice, because there's so many people who are like, if I just buy this app, I'm going to be able, it's so easy for me to write. But TextEdit is literally on every computer.
Yeah. Yeah, not enough people think about the structure of the product. They think, I think, thinking about the process of making something is important, but you should think more about the structure of what you want to make as opposed to the process by which you should make it. So, I try to do a healthy amount of nerding out about the process and looking at the architecture of a book, but eventually you just have to write.
Right, yeah. Yeah. Man. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate your time. I think that this is going to be great. Our listeners are going to love this. So thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, it's so fun to talk about this stuff. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for joining us, Chris.